So let's move on here. Let's talk about VMS RBAC. So as I mentioned before, there is a variable that can be set is that we may want to go through and leverage our existing infrastructure, be it Active Directory or OpenLDAP, to allow access to VMS, to do administration on the cluster. Now, this does not mean that just by doing this that I'm going to allow every single user in the environment to go through and connect to the VAST and administer the VAST. This just means we'll be able to use this provider, and for the groups that I define, we will allow them to administer the cluster, and we can use our passwords that are in Active Directory or in LDAP to gain that access. So we do this with a couple of things. So when we go through and configure VMS RBAC, we configure this based on groups. So we don't enable individual users from Active Directory or individual users from OpenLDAP. We define groups that are allowed, and then we define rights that those groups have. So you have a group that already exists. You can say, like, your VAST admins group. I want to use a VAST admin group, so I'm going to give them this amount of rights. You can do that. That way, as you add additional users to that VAST admin group, so you don't have to change anything on the VAST side. We'll just go through, and when the user connects up, we'll say, oh, hey, they're part of the VAST admin group, and they can go through and administer VMS through that. The passwords are managed via your existing methods, so we're not managing any passwords locally on the VAST. We're going to rely on Active Directory or LDAP for that. And as such, if the account is locked in Active Directory, they're going to be locked out of VMS as well. So very, very simple for that. So when we go through and we want to enable a provider, we go through and we edit the provider, and under advanced, there's going to be this VMS authentication provider. By default, we don't turn this on for any provider. So if you want to enable this, you can go through and edit, click VMS authentication provider, turn that on. And then the only other requirement is that this provider needs to be configured as part of a tenant. Even if the tenant isn't used for anything else, it needs to be configured as part of a tenant. Now, there are going to be some changes coming up when it comes to VAST 5.3, where we start introducing some multi-tenant VMS abilities with that. So the rules will change slightly coming with 5.3, but the provider needs to be configured as part of a tenant in order to be able to use that to access VMS. It can't just be a provider by itself, configured at the cluster level, that isn't used by any tenant. So as a caution here, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we have this connection encrypted. So for OpenLDAP, make sure you're using TLS, or for Active Directory, make sure you're using TLS for encryption, or you're using SASL for encryption, or LDAPS for the connection, to make sure that those are encrypted. So with that here, we go through, if I want to go through and I want to enable this within VMS, we just said, okay, this provider is going to be used for checking users. We need now to define how those users have access. So we do that via a defined role. VAST does have several defined roles for this. So we can configure these default roles. We can go through, we can add groups to the default roles if we want. But we can't modify the existing default roles in terms of their permissions. So I'm going to talk about how we create a new role. So the new role is going to go through, and we edit the role itself, or we create a new role for this. And we can select which realms we want to give them access and what kind of rights we want to give them access to. And then under here for the Open Active Directory LDAP groups, we just need to start providing the group name. So what you'll see here as I start typing in the group here, it will start to autocomplete, give you a list of things. So as I start typing domain, it's going to give me domain admins, domain controllers, domain guests, domain users there. I need to select which one I need to use for this. Once I click on that, and it highlights in a nice oval on that, then we'll do that. We hit update, and we're good to go. Same thing with creating a new role. Create a new role, define the name for it, define which realms and the rights we want to use, the Active Directory groups we want to use, and click create, and it'll create those. So let's talk about what these different realms are and what they allow for. So these realms are relatively coarse in terms of definition. They do allow quite a few things for this. So events is going to include things like how do we manage the alarms and events in the system? Do they have the ability to create new alarms or configure the alarms or disable alarms for that? Hardware includes hardware access. I want to allow them to update or add devices to the cluster or add additional C nodes and D boxes and things like that. Logical is a very big realm. Logical encompasses creating things like views and view policies and quotas and VIP pools for that. Very, very, very broad for that. Monitoring includes anything related to analytics. Security is going to be going through and configuring the managers and the roles for that. Settings are other miscellaneous settings. And support is going to control the support related function. Can I create views? Can I create can I create bundles? What operations do I have there? Starting with 5.2, we've got the ability to go through and customize these realms. So we can create new realms with custom definitions for them. So again, like with the logical realm, we may want to cut that down. Maybe I just want to create a quota administrator type role for someone. So I can do that. I'll just go through and say, tell it to create a new realm. And then I will select which entities I want to use. So here, if I want to be a quota administrator, I say, hey, I want to use my quota entry info, my quota, user quota entries there. I can give them just rights to those. And we can create the realm for that. And then the way that looks here is that when we go through, we would see that realm showing up here. For this, we'd see a custom role underneath this, or custom realm underneath this. We're going to add those in. And again, as I said, we can go through and create and define what types of rights. Are they allowed to create new things like create new VIP pools? Are they just allowed to view existing ones? Are they allowed to edit existing ones? Are they allowed to delete things? So we can control those there. And then finally, the last part is with the login process. Really, the login process for VMS is that we'll go through, we'll attempt to bind into the provider for this when someone logs in and do their group lookups and things like that. And if they're allowed to go through and bind, we'll store that information for 10 minutes. But that's we're not doing constant queries of things for that. So very quick, very simple to go through and do that.